couple of things as we get started this evening. It's just certainly a pleasure to be with you. I am going to be talking about a topic that is personal to all of us. We all have deep and very personal experiences with death. And as a scientist, I'm well aware when you open up those conversations, they can be painful. I'm going to focus on physical death, biotic death, and that interaction. And I'm not going to explore so much the theological questions, although I want to touch on the interface. And Samuel Clemens has a great quote. It was on the registrar's packet at Central Washington. The registrar put it on there. This quote from Sam Clemens, Mark Twain, said, "Get your facts straight first, and then you can distort them at your leisure." And at the bottom of this enrollment package was, "These facts are provided for your enjoyment." So I'm going to provide some facts on death tonight. I'm going to talk to you about some things. I spent most of that, the paper that I published, dealing with the phenomenology of death in ecology as an event, as something we see. And I'll touch on some of that tonight. But I've changed the title here because I want to move on to the necessity of death, because I think as we begin to theorize and think about the role of death in this good creation, the good earth that God has put us on, I don't see, as a biologist, that death is an option. It's not an optional event. Endings are important, and they're instrumental, and they're actually creative and good. Well, that's quite a challenge to try and demonstrate that for you, and we'll see what we can do. So tonight I'll talk about what is death a bit. We'll get some phenomenology on that. I'm going to talk about its ecological purpose, its role, if you like. And then toward the end, I'll get at the question of the problem of pain, suffering, and death. Because that is the thing that is really being pushed and placed in front of us in this century, in the last 20th century and the 21st, in a way that perhaps we've never seen that before. We are the dominant creature on this planet in every way, and death reigns and comes to us and with us, and so it's an important topic, and it's become a central theological challenge as well. So let's start this way. What is this? Now, some of you might know, especially if you come from an agricultural background. Maybe you've seen this. Is it evil? I wonder. For those of you who haven't seen a yellow dung fly up close, they're marvelous creatures. There are males and females. I see some clusters there, and you can see a little blurriness. Typically, those will be either males competing with one another, or there'll be 2 or 3 males around a female who's landed on this great resource that has been provided probably by a Holstein herd. And that's recycled grass. And you can't really make that out, but we used to play with these all the time. And this is pretty fresh still. That's where you'll see the flies. As they get a little older, they start to dry out. And when they get nice and dry, then you use them like a Frisbee and other kinds of things. This is the sliding kind when you're running through the field, right? And anyway, all of those things. Some of you have experienced that. If you've grown up in the city, you've missed out on this. But the question is, what is going on here? And is this evil in some way? Well, you see death in front of you there. It's biotic death, the death of those plants. If we take a deep look at recycling, I'm an entomologist by training, as David said, and I worked in aquatic systems, fresh water, in particular in streams. I did my master's work in the Cascade Mountains, just out of Everett, Washington, over toward Wenatchee, high in those mountains, and spent 3 years up and down those streams. Then went to California and spent 6 years in the streams in coastal California that experienced either drought conditions or what they just had here in the last few weeks, washout. There's tremendous flood conditions. And you see if you look closely at the material in the stream, you'll see in this micrograph there's actually a series of diatoms there, and there's debris and material. What you're looking at is a micrograph of the feces of an animal. This is a mayfly, and that mayfly consumes leaves that are decomposing in the stream, and then it will defecate. And that material will be rapidly colonized by bacteria, by diatoms, by fungi, protozoa, an entire community of organisms on that little particle of feces. And we really talk about this kind of thing as something like an inverted peanut butter sandwich. It's the bread's on the inside, and the really good lipids and proteins and all the good stuff is on the outside. And this gets recycled down the stream. And the feces of this creature become the food for another creature further down the stream. And so you see that process. And if we look here, this is a simple diagrammatic way to try and capture this notion of how death works in a system. Is looking at abiotic and biotic processes. You see a leaf falls, goes to the ground, worms come up, pull that under the soil microorganisms feeding the roots, and a typical system. We've got a great story here in the Pacific Northwest. We call these salmon forests out here. Our fisheries DFO scientist on Vancouver Island discovered that, in fact, the phosphorus from the Pacific Ocean, which is taken up by the feeding of those salmon, these 5 species of Pacific salmon that come sweeping up our streams, and they die. Their bodies then form nutrients that feed a zooplankton and phytoplankton bloom inside of our lakes, like up at Adams Lake and the Great Sockeye runs. But they also work their way by eagles, magpies, jays, coyotes, bear, black bear. They work their way, and mice and other things, they work their way upslope. And if you put radioactive traces in there, you actually find that those phosphorus nutrients move right up into the trees and feed the great forests. In the tropics, they're called bat forests, where the bats do a similar kind of harvesting of nutrients. So what we see then is these various biotic, abiotic, living, non-living compartments. And life is this continuous cycling. Well, I've just told you what you learned in grade school, junior high. We learned that. We know that. We maybe not quite in the depth that we teach it in our undergraduate courses, but we know that. But do we think about what the implications are as we move through? So there's leaf fall. Death is a pervasive phenomenon in ecological relationships. But the problem of death is not a new question. And in front of you is a slide of the kind of question. You have here on the left here, you have a cocoon of a caterpillar and a wasp, which is in the process of stinging, but in this case it's ovipositing and laying its egg inside of that caterpillar. Here, if you do any gardening here, this is an aphid, and it's an aphid mummy. And the wasp that was here has pupated, and the adult has emerged out of and left the exoskeleton, the husk of that aphid behind. So that we recognize, and we've recognized for a long time, that death is ever present. It's a pervasive phenomenon in ecological relationships. The ecological services of living systems are animated at every level by mortality, cessation, and bodily or physical endings. Our challenge is to find a comprehensive theory of death to encompass these observations. It is what the authors of a book called The Biology of Death, Karsfeld and Reda, back in 2000, called the Copernicization. We need to Copernicanize. We need to theorize death. And as biologists, remarkably, we haven't. It's surprising how few times death is used in a biological text. You can search ecology texts, and you do not find death or mortality mentioned. Rarely. What you find instead is the detailed coverage of physical disturbance, various kinds of mortality mechanisms. And we say it was a disturbance. A fire burned your home and destroyed you, and you've been disturbed. Right? Yes, you have. In the most lethal way. Wind and other forces, so drought, flood, all of those conditions. So we have these euphemisms that we're using continuously to describe death, but we don't speak directly to it. In a source book of keywords in evolutionary biology, for instance, predation and extinction are listed, but not mortality or death. And this lack of detailed attention to death means that it remains under-theorized in biology. Life sciences may actually simply be reflecting a societal discomfort. Now, we're moving out of that somewhat today, and we're starting to have the conversations about death. And I think we're doing so because my generation is the baby boom. I'm at the front end, born in 1947, and we burst the doors on every societal institution we came into the elementary schools, and then the junior highs. They built a new one in town, then into the high school, and then went off to university, and we busted the doors out. This huge wave of aging humans is about to die. I know that when I get up in the morning. And I know it at night if I need to be reminded. I can tell. And I may not like it, but it is a fact of life, as we say. And interestingly, I just thought it was quite surprising that we would have a discussion here in Canada and would pass the law on euthanasia with very little conversation. And I'll come back to that at the end. I think we didn't have near the conversation we could have, and perhaps it has something to do with the fact that we haven't been paying attention, and maybe we have some discomfort residual there. Well, the Darwinian method really brought this forward. It is widely thought to present challenges to the biblical understanding of God's creative works. It was thought so when it was proposed in 1859, and a number of Christians worked their way, and theologians. There was a lot of theological work done in the 19th century, and largely by the 1880s and the 1890s, most theologians had come to be able to deal with evolutionary theory and see that within their understanding of the biblical mechanisms. By the 1920s, particularly here in North America, that all changed with the rise of fundamentalism and then eventually evangelicalism that arises out of that in the 1940s. And that was the beginning of the American Scientific Affiliation. It's a group of Christians, men and women, in the natural and social sciences. And it starts in that period of time. And evolution was the big problem. Natural selection is one of those basic mechanisms. But it involves mutation, migration, genetic drift. Well, that's what you learn. But in fact, it involves death. Natural selection. And then we get the notion of nature red in tooth and claw. And so the question, and we have rightly sort of recoiled from some of the social applications of that, misapplications, I should say, of that notion. But biologically, I'm not sure that we have dealt with it appropriately. So as an ecologist, let me introduce you to the types of death. This comes from Colinvaux's text in the 1970s. It's a fairly comprehensive accounting of 7 different mechanisms by which organisms die. Death by starvation, or malnutrition, which is a different predation directly, death in the chase, and that's the one here, the cheetah going after the antelope is the most common that we see. This is the Nature program, it's David Attenborough, it's David Suzuki, it's all those programs that we watched. There's parasitic disease. But interestingly, there's death by accident. And so I'd say death by accident is a rockfall. If you're a pica here in the Talus Slopes, up here in the Cascades, somewhere, and rocks begin to move down slope, and you die. Is that the result of evil in the world? Is the force of gravity a force of evil? And that's the kind of question that we start to ask. Then there's the failure to find a mate. Biologically, without reproduction, you are genetically dead. And then the failure to be born, as these here in the lower picture, all of these fetuses that came from a deer that was hit, and we see deer along the highway all the time in the common course of our driving. These animals are hit, many of them are pregnant, and then failure to be born. But it goes even further than this sort of gross phenomenological level. Today there's an abundance of new research in ecological studies on death and on senescence and the processes of dying. Yet biological death remains a profound mystery to us. Through long and personal association, it's difficult for us to see death as anything but evil. But in fact, I would suggest that death is shaping our entire biotic world, everything that we see. The influence begins at the cellular level. And I'll start here with the discovery in the 20th century of programmed cell death. This is a white worm, Caenorhabdus elegans. It has become the invertebrate lab rat, if you like. It's replaced the fruit fly in terms of a system for working on, the biologist. The number of cells, this is what graduate students do, because you can get them to do this, and you can't get prisoners or rats or other, no. You can get graduate students to sit at a microscope and count the cells. And as this animal develops from a single cell, fertilized, divides to 2, 4, 8, 16, and on, and they followed entirely through. There's the exact number is escaping me. If we've got a developmental biologist, they can tell me it's 1,269 cells, and then some go away. And there's just over 1,000 cells in each of these animals. And the remarkable thing is, in 1983, I believe it was, when I was just starting my undergraduate teaching career, the Nobel Prize was given for the discovery of programmed cell death. And they described in the late 1970s sitting at the microscope and watching a cell die and recognizing that it was dying under genetic control. It wasn't accidentally dying. It was dying for developmental reasons. And that was a remarkable insight. It actually had been seen in the 19th century, but it wasn't until the 20th century that we began to understand what that might mean. And as we'll see, it means a lot as we go forward. Here's how this works. Well, you see the arrows there pointing to cells. They have a characteristic shape. You see how round they are. These are cells that are in the process of undergoing programmed cell death under a genetically controlled process. Here's what happens. As we develop, as organisms develop, tetrapods like ourselves, vertebrates, our limbs develop. And they go through a process. And in fact, you get a series of digits forming. But in some cases, the genetic program that controls our development doesn't operate as what we call normally, and you end up with incomplete separation, a webbing between the toes. I would guess that there's at least one person in this room, don't raise your hand, who has webbing in between your toes. There may be someone who has it between their fingers, a little bit more. And if you're Mark Spitz or who's the other famous swimmers? Yes, if that's a really handy, big hands with little bits of extra webbing on them. That can give you 1/100th of a second, and that's a gold medal. There's all kinds of things. Here it is in the fingers, where the fingers fail to separate. Programmed cell death operates to destroy and kill those cells between those digits for normal formation. But it's not just a matter of the cells in our hands. This extends to many different types of things. It's sculpting of the animal digits. It's sculpting of the tree and the outside. It's the formation of bark. It's the formation of your skin. Your skin is dead cells filled with keratin, protein. And that's under genetic control. It's the tail in metamorphosis being resorbed in a frog. It's the metamorphosis of a butterfly from a caterpillar and the complete rearrangement and the dying of some cells and the regrowth of new ones. It is the adjusting of cell numbers, and most importantly, why this has really taken off, it's in cancer. That is, the elimination of dangerous or injured cells. So we have two kinds of technical things that are going on. There's programmed cell death, which has this positive function, apoptosis it's called, but you also have necrosis. So if you get an injury, these cells will die. That's what happens if you get cut or bruised. And you have injury and healing, and you have good wound healing. I used to play with that as a kid. I don't know if you ever did that around in grade school. You don't scratch at your scabs. Stop that. What's going on there? You know, and in fact, you recognize that there's something really remarkable happening. Well, in fact, these cells that are dying and injured then are cleaned up. They're removed from the body. Good thing. And in fact, those processes go on all over. Here's lens formation. So stem cells in the embryo, as the lens is going to be forming, they migrate. There's a stimulation gradient, proliferation and migration and differentiation. Your lens of your eye is made up of a complex series of layers of cells, and those cells have actually undergone programmed cell death. Now here's a sequence. It starts as a cell here with normal staining. You see the nucleus of that cell. The nucleus undergoes a series of steps and breaks down so that the lens in our eye is transparent. It's almost empty of all the little cell organelles, all the machinery that would be necessary. And it's one of the reasons why when you get to be my age and you go in for an eye test, he says, you have cataracts starting, but they're not ripe yet. Oh, okay. And you're about a 4. We'll give you surgery at about 7 or 8. Or it may turn out, one of my colleagues is working on zebrafish. It turns out that in zebrafish, you can damage the lens surface and they will regenerate. They've retained some of that machinery in an interesting way, and they have an extra layer there. So we know that some organisms have mechanisms. So this is very interesting in developmental biology, for cancer treatment, for all kinds of purposes. Biologists are carefully studying death and dying. And we recognize that programmed cell death as a system is actually genetically conserved. Now the mechanisms are not exactly the same, but these are complex mechanisms between the C. elegans, that Caenorhabdus, where it was first described, in figure 1 there, in fruit flies, in mammals. It turns out that recently we've discovered that programmed cell death is operating in bacteria, not just in the complex organisms, multicellular, but in single-celled organisms. And now, as an aquatic biologist, I get interested. This is where the skin-out guy, the biology of the environment, comes to play. When I started reading several years ago, I discovered that programmed cell death informed a problem that we had as limnologists, that's aquatic biologists. We grow phytoplankton. We want to understand the blooms. Most of your lakes here on the BC coast, most of these lakes are pretty pristine. They're fairly clear. You don't have any sort of really pea soup lakes around. You don't have any really good greeny. Over in Alberta, our lakes, because they're naturally what we call eutrophic, naturally enriched, lots of nutrients, and they turn green in August. But you have phytoplankton in your lakes as well. These complex succession of these. Well, we would grow those in the lab and model them. And all of a sudden, the for no reason that we could explain, we would have a colony, it would just collapse. It would be growing along fine, and in the middle of your experiment, everything would die. And we have no explanation for that. I went through graduate school in the late 70s and the early 80s, and it was a mystery. And so he said, well, we just didn't clean things out. We contaminated. It was something we did. Oceanographers were observing the same thing happening, only not in the laboratory, in a laboratory culture, a microcosm. They were seeing it happen in the ocean. Now they're seeing it happen where in a matter of 1 or 2 days, a phytoplankton bloom across tens and hundreds of square kilometers would suddenly collapse. All the cells would die, and the water would turn clear. What is going on? In the late 1980s and the early 1990s, we discovered the mechanism of programmed cell death operating in phytoplankton blooms. Now we have programmed cell death, not operating just at the single cell level, but this is operating at an ecosystem level, and those organisms, phytoplankton in the ocean, are exchanging nutrients, elemental exchange, what we call a biogeochemical pathways of carbon, phosphorus, nitrogen, sulfur, other compounds, and now we're talking about the entire biosphere. We're talking about ocean-wide phenomenon. And programmed cell death, this little mechanism that operates down at the cell level, is setting ecosystem-level processes. It turns out, when you look out, let's just do a little experiment. Think about a duck's foot. You have it mentally? Now think about a chicken's foot. Think about a tree leaf. It could be a deciduous, what? Like our big leaf maple here, or it could be a coniferous tree. How does that shape happen? How does that shape happen? It happens because of programmed cell death. What that means to an ecologist is that when I look out at a landscape, I cannot see that landscape except for death. Physical death is operating there. And I'm not talking about the leaves falling you got to rake up in the fall. The very formation of the trees, everything about everything that you see. And that is the implication, and as I say, I think the necessity for death. Well, here's a story. Take a look. Isn't that a beautiful picture? It's one of my favorite views. It reminds me of the Adams River and the Shuswap and that kind of area in the interior. Think with me for a minute on these pictures. What do you see? Well, there's a lovely agrarian view. There's a vineyard and fields. There's forest and slopes. There's a river coursing through a deep rocky canyon. There's an abundance of sockeye salmon making their way up to their natal stream. They return each year. Every 4th year, there's a bumper crop of amazing numbers when they come back. And the river turns red for as far as your eye can see with these green-headed beauties. They come in October. They're decked out in Christmas colors, it seems. They were running in those streams when Joseph and Mary were making their way for the census. They were running in those streams. They were dying in those streams. Their bodies were fertilizing these great lakes and the forest here. But I want you to look deeper. Go behind the beauty and the abundance. So what do you see? What sustains it? What supports it? What supplies it? What maintains and renews this recycling system? What is there in that photo that's just out of your view that you can't quite see? It's like the infrastructure in our cities, or like in this building, for instance. Hidden in the walls and the ceiling and under the floors, there are all kinds of metal and plastic and mechanical systems. There's one that's amplifying my voice right now to you. There's one that's lighting this. The air is being exchanged here. And then there are the blueprints that are created out of an architect's inspiration and artistic skill, together with the craftsmanship of contractors and tradespeople. There were the materials that were brought together, the hewers of wood and miners of metal, right? And drawers of water, that we are a design and a manufacturing and a transportation system, and there was energy to make it all. And if you push a little deeper through the infrastructure, there's the material substance. There's the ordering not only of the social fabric that makes these things happen, but there's also the laws, and there's the chemical weathering, there's the biogeochemical processing, and there's photosynthesis going on there. And there, hidden in that picture, is an amazing array of these processes that we describe as scientists, but we don't see them. And if you go even deeper in the world that Arnold lives in as a physicist, you go a little bit deeper, lie fundamental laws of physics that we have described, and we have some understanding of those processes. There are the four fundamental forces. There's a strong force and a weak nuclear force. There's the things that hold atoms together. You've got protons. Remember, Jack, he teach this to you, right? And he said, oh yeah, you two positive particles, we hold them together. We just kind of, just sort of there. And you go, yeah, right. And we dutifully remember this and memorize it, and then we use that. So these fundamental, and then there's There's electromagnetism that allows us to walk across the floor, right? And does amazing things. And it's behind all of the interactions that are happening in your body and mind right now to keep us alive. And then there's gravity, the gravitational interaction. Those fundamental forces, and they're right there in that picture. They're right there, if you can see them. Our problem is that death is operating at all of those levels. Endings are operating. Molecules are ending. In some cases, atoms are ending. But I've checked with my physicist and my particle people, and they tell me that leptons and quarks probably aren't ending. They probably are the one eternal thing in the universe on the order of 10 to the 36 or some number that's larger than the length of the age of the universe. But every other place we have endings happening. And we need to be thinking about this. This is a problem in our tradition that views death and ending as only a negative, as only something that is bad. I think we need to rethink that from this perspective. So there's a necessity, and we need to theorize this death. Because in fact, we don't really have a great handle on death or on life at its beginning or its ending. Typical of a biologist, they'll teach you that, well, there are 7 characteristics of living things, and they'll go through those attributes, and you know something's living because you memorized those and you used them on the test that you took. But in fact, it turns out it's much more problematic than that. Are viruses alive? Are these little replicators alive? And it's not just viruses. There's a suite of organisms. There are megaviruses. There are small particles that are replicators, but by any stretch of the imagination, you might not call them alive. And then there are these complex organisms like water bears that you can actually freeze, and you can take them up in space, and you can just expose them there, and they don't show any sign of energetic exchange. They are just a little cyst. They just hang around. And then if you put them in the right water conditions, they come back to life. So they were alive. Were they dead when they were a cyst? They didn't have any of the properties. They didn't respond to any of the things that living things do. So there's these very interesting, and I'm just touching lightly on the questions about, we're trying to figure out, how do we say life happens? Where does this, we know that it's not some vitalist force, so how do we explain this? At the other end, we have death. And death is not easy to explain either. We have laws that tell us when something's dead. But if you watched Princess Bride, you know there's dead and mostly dead. Now, Billy Crystal, Dave wrote a great line there, right? But there's something serious behind that. It turns out that the notion of brain death that we all just sort of assume that doctors can tell us isn't actually as clear-cut as we think. Because when I was the age of the young people I had dinner with tonight, a doctor in South Africa killed someone. Because in the mid-1960s and the early 1960s, if your heart stopped, you were dead. Your heart stopped, you're dead. It didn't really get your heart going again. And this doctor stopped the guy's heart. And he started again. And then he put a mechanical heart in. But he was dead for a while. And then all of a sudden, and it turns out that we can maintain people longer and longer at that interface between life and death, and it becomes more and more challenging. Now, as an ecologist, I'm well out of my comfort zone in terms of example and firsthand experience with this, but my colleagues who do work in the medical field say that we are facing a real challenge here of knowing what death is and how we define it clearly and deal with it. So in creation care, the place that I do work, there are some things that I want to talk about. I'm going to give you just 4 examples. And these are applications in the ecological area of caring for creation, our role as stewards of God's good earth. And the first is that biotic death, it appears to me, was present from the beginning. You see it in Genesis, even though it isn't being talked about. Are fruitfulness and death twins in creation? Is there any way to conceive of be fruitful and multiply? As a biologist, you do that thought experiment, and you cannot get through one day of division of the microorganisms present. You can't get through one day unless you consume something. And we have, from our perspective in the traditional view here in the West, neatly divided plant life and animal life. And so if you're a vegan or a vegetarian, then you don't kill things. But a lot of things died tonight because I had rice and soybean. Soybean formed it looked like chicken. It sort of feels like chicken, but it's not. It's soybeans. And there's a continuity of life that we now describe. And this simple separation between animal and plant is a phenomenological view that makes sense to us, but it makes no sense at the level of the organism to separate those out. There is no easy separation that one can make unequivocally in that continuum. So I would suggest that as you enter the garden, that death was present there. Physical, biotic endings. And it's just to acknowledge what I think is a good thing. We had dinner tonight. Our very lives are dependent upon the death of these creatures. And their lives are tied together with ours in a deeply relational way. And the theologians who have gotten in the sense of the Trinitarian view of the creation, the community, the communal nature, the relational nature of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are suggesting to us that this relational creation is simply a reflection of a God who is relational. I've written a paper on that. I gave that talk back here in about 2000 or so when I was here on biophilia and the gospel. This innate tendency we have to pay attention to these beautiful views of the created order. We respond to life because that's how we live. A second thing is that land is a gift, and that gift includes death. there's something really interesting in Moses' view of land. If you go through and read carefully in Deuteronomy, it says some very interesting things about the land. In Deuteronomy 30, Moses sums up something that I think most of us have missed, or we simply read past it. And that is that he calls the children of Israel together, and he says to them, today I give you blessings and cursings. It's at the end of his physical life. And on one hand is Mount Ebal, and on the other hand is Mount Gerizim. It's this great story. And I give you blessings and cursings. Today I give you the opportunity to choose life or choose death. And in that context, when you read it, he says, I call on heaven and earth as witness against you and your decision. It is as if the court of creation is present around us and waiting to see what decision we will take. I think what we've done is we've read that metaphorically. We've read it, that's interesting poetic language. But I think Moses understood it differently. If you read through Deuteronomy, the land and our social well-being are closely tied up. He constantly formulates the land, the widow, the fatherless, the alien and sojourner in your midst. Care for these. Do this law. Do the Shema. Remember that the Lord is one, and it will go well with you. And he repeats that again and again at the end of his life. He ties it together, and he brings it together and says the entire creation will witness what you do in this place. The land inherently means that there will be death, and it includes it. Then flourishing depends upon endings. To be able to flourish in some way. I think about the metaphors of pruning that show up. And we know that in gardening, it's necessary to thin. You simply must do so. With fishes in a pond, they must be thinned. If predators don't act, then what you get is not flourishing, but you get a debilitating kind of growth. You don't get the flourishing of creation. So as a creation care mechanism, it's important for us to understand that we're not going to be able to preserve every life. We're not going to be able to keep everything. And that means something in a world in which 99% of all species throughout geologic history have gone extinct and are past. Does that mean they're worthless? They're no good? They were worn out? No. And it's just as the same for us as we approach our stewardship of creation. It doesn't give us license to do anything we want. It means that we need to be very careful in what we do. And so I think we need to pay attention to the mechanisms of death and dying, and how we need to have conversation about this, and not just see it as some sort of universal evil to be ignored. And finally, the fourth one I'll touch on tonight is the theodicy question. Theodicies are not likely to give us the answer. Job and the biblical understanding of suffering and God's creative works tells us a very interesting story. And as I've read Job over the years, and I've read theologians struggle with it, I come to the place that Celia Dean Drummond has come to, a British scholar who's now at Notre Dame. And she's trained with a PhD in botany and a doctorate in theology, and a highly productive scholar who's thought deeply about these questions of animal suffering and death. And at the end of that, you end up almost in a corner. You end up trying to answer the question of suffering and death. And it seems like we've come to a dead end on this. And Brad Gregory, a Catholic historian, has written on the unintended Reformation, the consequences of reformational thinking and what happened to us. And Mark Knoll, if some of you may know, the retired now historian, formerly at Wheaton College and then at Notre Dame, the sort of dean of evangelical historians, has also written on this question. The question is a very technical thing that comes up in the 13th century, a debate between Thomas Aquinas and John Duns Scotus. So you get two Catholic academics arguing about the univocity of being. And as an ecologist, I first read that, I go, the what of what? And I think, and I mentioned this to my wife, and she says, "You're not going to tell them that, are you?" And I said, "Well, I'll say a little bit about it." I think Gregory's done an excellent job of showing us how this has actually led us to the kind of thinking, almost a dead end in the Enlightenment. What univocity of being means is that it's a question of the nature of God. What is God in relationship to the created order? Is God entirely transcendent and other, or is God a being, a different being, but a being like us as beings? Does he have, and does God participate and have the same character? This is a theological question that ended up being answered by saying yes in the Reformation, that in fact it set up, as historians tell us, the Enlightenment. It set up the scientific method. It set up the capacity to think about the created order in the way that we have. But in an unintended way, it's also led us into a bit of a dead end. And so we're trying to make sense out of God's character and what he's doing by looking directly at the created order. Now, this is beyond the scope of this evening, and this is a paper yet to be written. But for those of you, and there may be some theologians or historians in the room, this is the cutting edge of, I think, of where we're going to be thinking about it. And my message is that as a biologist, I would urge you to think about death, because when I look through Gregory's index, I don't find mortality, I don't find death talked about. I don't think we can talk about the question of the univocity of being, this deep question about God's character and relationship to the created order, without talking about the nature of physical death and how it operates. And I think it will be quite informative to us if we do that. Now, coming closer to home, this is why I think discussions about death are really important. Some of you in the room will recognize this young man. And maybe one or two of you had him in class. His dad introduced this whole program tonight. And William is finishing up his PhD work and is fortunate enough to work with material sciences, and they're working on something called Texas peg nanoribbons, and doing some work that will allow them in their experimental work to actually knit together and heal the wounding of spinal columns. And that's a powerful development. And he's rightly been given a lot of attention for that very successful work. I think if I remember correctly in the reading on this, the Korean scientists who did this work transected the spinal columns on mice, and within 4 days they had some functioning already back in their legs. Okay, by using this material, it's painted on. It goes on as a liquid and becomes a kind of fabric-like structure. Oh, it's a fascinating, absolutely remarkable breakthrough. The potential for spinal cord injuries and other good is just huge. And then William was interviewed on Quirks and Quarks, and this question came up. Because Dr. Sergio Canavero, an Italian surgeon, has for a number of years been thinking about doing a whole body transplant, a head replacement. I had that suggested to me a number of times in my life, But seriously, in the 1970s, this was done for a few days with a rhesus monkey, and it is being proposed. And it wasn't that I just woke up one day and said, I want to do a head transplant. He's actually been laying out this procedure for some time, and he's argued it represents the key to everlasting life. Interesting language. Where are we going, and what are we going to say about this if we think that death is an unmitigated evil and an enemy to be fought, and we have nothing to say about biological endings? I want to see this young scientist, this young computer specialist, healed. Okay. And I can tell you from old enough in this room to have watched absolutely miraculous things that when I was an undergraduate, we're doing now today regularly. We just said, no, that's not going to happen. And it's happening. And William's working on a technology that will make this perhaps possible. And there are all kinds of issues and other questions involved with this about phantom pain and will it succeed and the psychological issues. And there's a suite of questions there that we need to enter into. But William said, I have a choice to make. I can either help him or not. And he's going to do it anyway. What do I do? I think we need to think deeply about death and what physical death means. I think we need to theorize that. I think we need to figure out what that life means. I think we need to talk about it in other than just theological terms so that we can begin to speak into these central questions that are coming up. And I'll end with this. I think we need to recover what my pastor years ago called finishing well. Now, this is the father-in-law sitting in the chair of one of my students, John Bonham. My student is Kevin Cantillon. That's Connor, his son, so it's John's grandson. John Bonham was a pastor for 35 or 40 some years in the greater Edmonton area. And this is a picture taken before Christmas. John died on December 22nd. And you can see him. He's holding the unfinished box. Here you see the finished box. And Connor there is an artist. He's doing the artwork. Here's part of it on one of the faces. There's artwork all around. And what is that box? And what's John saying? That's a mortuary box. His ashes are going in there. And he's got a wry smile on his face. Okay? I'm going in there. I am going to finish well. I'm going to finish with my grandson's loving attention to me. I will be remembered. I remember my pastor going back through the Old Testament patriarchs, and one after another, describing them, calling their children to their bedsides, blessing them, and ending their lives. In some cases, I remember one phrase, I've forgotten who it is in the exact passage, turning his face to the wall, right, and dying. There is a sense that we've lost in our culture of dying well. And I find some of my secular colleagues are trying to recapture that in various ways. And I think we need to think more deeply about this notion of biotic death and what that means for us. And with that, I'll take some questions.
I'm delighted that you mentioned death in Genesis in the garden, because I've often thought there must have been some kind of death there. So what about post this life in heaven, or what about death there?
Great question. And shall I just defer to my theological friends? No. No, I have a feeling about that. And I think Paul is just very clear. It seems like if I had to go somewhere, I would go to, he talks about a grain of wheat falling in the ground and dying. Unless it die, right, it can't come forth. And he's talking about us dying and the life after. And then he says, this life and that life are not the same. We look through it in Corinthians, right? We're looking through a glass dimly. We have a kind of a thing. Then you see Jesus showing up. And first of all, they don't recognize him. And when they do recognize him, he's completely other. And there he is eating. He's eating food. He's talking with him. He says, here, touch. Go ahead. Stick your finger right there. Come on. And then he walks through walls and he disappears on them. And you go, what in the world? It is so other. It is so different. So there's a continuity and a discontinuity theologically. Now, my friends are beginning to point to some interesting passages, my theological friends. They're pointing to things like Moses and the burning bush. And Moses goes, I gotta look at this thing. This is a bush that's on fire, but it's not consumed. I've never seen anything like that. And suddenly you see the transcendent, the eternal. You see God present there, well, a form, but you see the creaturely structure, and they're both there together. And they're not competing with one another. There's not one trying to muscle the other out. They're both together. So there's something about this, the eternal life. And it's very difficult for us to talk about what in the world that is. And I take some comfort in that because the university idea, to go back to that, the challenge there is, can you get with your mind to understand God? If you think that God is a creature, a being on the scale just different than us, just larger, stronger, more transcendent, or you think God is other, suddenly I think the notion of revelation, we would not know these things, but they are revealed to us. You didn't think your way to this. I think the scientific, this is my humble opinion as a scientist, I spent my career and my life, and I'll continue to write in the sciences. I just don't think that's going to get me to salvation or to a complete understanding. It'll tell me how the world works. But I think I need revelation. And at this question of what, then I'm with Paul, and I'm with John in the book of Revelation, and it is okay. Thank you.
It was an interesting talk. Just a quick question. If sin hadn't entered the world and death through sin, if Adam and Eve hadn't sinned, would they still have died of old age? Or would they just have continued living?
Well, it's complete speculation. And there's two parts to that answer, is that who do you think Adam and Eve were? And so now I'm saying you're formulating that question as Adam and Eve were individuals. And there are a number of theologians that say that doesn't work. And that is shocking to most of us. But some of you read Osborne's book. And there's a number of different theologians that are simply saying that's probably the wrong way to think about what that story is telling us. But now let's go inside of the story as we've received it as two individuals. You have a tree of what? You have a tree of life. Would they have lived forever if they had not sinned? I wonder. There's a tree of life and a tree of knowledge of good and evil. They take from one, and God says we must stop them from the other. And He acts to stop them from the other. That suggests I've read from many theologians, that in fact, if they hadn't, they would have died. physically, right? That physical death was part of that. So there was something else going on there that the story doesn't, that because of the way it happened, doesn't tell us. But that, let's play out your suppose, if they hadn't taken from the tree of life, then certainly eternal life would not have been available, and that would suggest that biotic death would have come to them.
I'm going to go to that question in a moment, but I just want to take this opportunity to also mention another event. I forgot to mention this one. Tomorrow night, there's a CSCA co-sponsored event as well, and this features Dennis Venema and his co-author Scott McKnight, and their talk tomorrow night, 7 o'clock at South Langley Church, which is really a book launch of Dennis and Scott's book called Adam and the Genome. And so very relevant to the question you interacted with as well. So there's a question up here. I'll bring the mic over there.
They will answer every question you have about Adam and Eve tomorrow night.
Although I really enjoyed the talk, and I've been actually thinking a lot about death myself. I have more of a theology background. I was just wondering, for you, in your ponderings, in your opinion, is there any philosophical or theological implications you have thought of with life needing to precede death, in the sense that you cannot have death until life, like life has to first happen and then you have death? That's just a thought that came to my mind. I didn't know if there was any implications because of that.
Yeah, I get a headache when I think about those things. That's a very challenging question, and it seems that you don't talk about endings without beginnings, and life is some beginning. I mean, think about it analogically. I mean, we go to sleep at night, and we go to this little mini death, and it's like I disappear, and then I wake up in the morning, and I don't. Where was I? Right, and there's this consciousness that sort of gets suspended. And I remember thinking about this when I was a kid. I don't know what must have been strange as a kid. I just remember thinking, where was I before I was? And I couldn't go anywhere with that. I just remember, all of a sudden I remember remembering. And then you go around and you look at babies and you realize that, well, some people remember events that happened in their lives when they're 2 years old, and I've had people say, oh yeah, something happened when I was 1, and I think, I'm glad I don't remember, because I had my legs burned pretty badly when I was about 3 years old. I have no memory of it, and I'm glad. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, I was wondering your thoughts on it, so that's fine. Yeah, no, I was just wondering your thoughts on it. I wasn't necessarily looking for a specific answer. It's just a thought I had, because, like, in the chain of events, like, obviously death biologically is even happening with ourselves very early on, but, like, you cannot have death without life, and life has to precede death for death to occur. Yeah, and so I just didn't know if there's any implications, because I haven't really thought about the question enough.
No. I think life is an expression of God's love. The creation is... The theologians I read on this is that what they're saying about creation, the created order, is that this is an act of God. He didn't have to create, wasn't filling up some missing need or emptiness in God's character, but out of the love comes this need to give life, and there it is. And then so I think the death piece of that follows, and I think that probably says something about Genesis 1. It doesn't specifically say, be fruitful and multiply and also die, so that other things can. It's not a utilitarian give and take thing there.
So we've got another question. We've got another question back here.
Thank you for your talk.
Mm-hmm.
I enjoyed your exhortation to theorize death. I took it as a philosophical and theological exhortation.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about the univocity of being. Yeah. It sounded like you favored Aquinas in the dispute with Scotus. And it seemed to me that your reason was Aquinas' understanding of being preserves the radical transcendence of God. Mm-hmm. I guess I'm wondering why you wouldn't side with Scotus, why you don't see univocity of being as necessary in order to account for something like programmed cell death. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Don't you think that is better accounted for in a unified vision of creation through something like the univocity of being?
Right. Excellent.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I'll work on that. I mean, that's exactly the cutting edge. I think that's what we have to think through. This is just fresh enough for me that I'm really struggling with this, but it seems to me that because we went with Scotus, and we opened the Enlightenment up, and we got to the place that we have, that is, we got to evolutionary theory, we got to natural selection and sexual selection, and now we've gotten to pain and extinction and death. We understand that in detail, and we are at a dead end in the sense that we're trying to explain God as some sort of quantum indeterminacy. That's where God's acting. It's the question of how God acts in the creation. And I just think it's gotten us into a dead end. And so I think it's an opportunity for us. And I'm not judging the end of this, because the reason we made that split, we made it for some good reasons, right? But I think certainly being a Protestant, I think our Catholic friends think that we made a mistake. And so there's the question, did we or didn't we? Historically, it's very interesting because the implications that we're talking about tonight weren't even on the table at the time that decision was made. We're just talking about the outworkings of this. And the person I would go to that's given me some encouragement on this is Blaise Pascal, the French Catholic charismatic believer. He's a scientist, mathematician, and he ends up staying with Aquinas. And I thought, I've always liked Pascal's pences, his little sayings. I thought, okay, maybe he's onto something. But I know enough about culturally how cultures shape us and our ideas. I think my ideas are really fresh and new in my own, and in fact, right, they're pretty socially and historically determined. So I don't know. But at the moment, I'm willing to entertain that. I want to open that up and explore that idea because I think it's a more fruitful way, because I feel like we have gotten ourselves into just an unhelpful way of thinking about pain and suffering and death. I don't believe any of the stories that we're telling. It feels like we're telling the same stories that Job's friends were telling. And finally, God appears in the longest speech in the Bible, the longest single discourse attributed to God. And he comes to Job, and all their arguments, and he does what? Have you seen my creation? Were you there? Do you understand? And so just a kind of simple reading of Job has me leaning that direction to say, I think this is worth exploring and rethinking and going back to that original decision point, because we have a different set of pressures on us, different set of questions that we're trying to answer than they were answering at the time of the Reformation. Okay? Thanks for that.
Thank you very much for that talk. I just have a quick question for you. A lot of your talk was about the necessity of death in the natural world and how that promotes essentially growth. How would you talk about the necessity of death in terms of research and all the anthropogenic factors that maybe, like, what is our role as humans in terms of animal research? What can we do along those lines in the necessity of death?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. And I remember sitting in graduate school and thinking about this. I'm working with insects, and I have thousands of these things that I'm raising behind me in the lab, and I'm measuring their head capsules, and I'm killing tens of thousands of insects all the time. And when I'm on the farm and we had to put a cat down, we had to put a dog down, we put down a beef cow, we butchered chickens. I didn't think too much about that. I did think about it, but I'm thinking, why am I thinking about this? They're insects. And then you get this notion of the continuity of living tissues. And I think we have to think very deeply before we take the life of an animal. And they're not just stuff. They're not just things. They are creatures. And it's very interesting. I mean, one of the emotional ways that I felt this was my daughter was about 4 or 5 years old. And we had a television on, and there was a special on poaching African elephants. And right on the television, bam, 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 just boom, elephant. And I remember she just went, that elephant, he not want to be dead. And I said, yes, honey, you're right. He not want to be dead. Okay. Those are bad men. That's wrong. But we're worried in the laboratory, but then I jump in my car and I drive down the road. And in order to keep Highway 1 open across the Coquihalla, we have to kill animals. They're going to be dying. We as conservation biologists work very hard, millions of dollars to put overpasses over in the national parks. We're trying to keep grizzly bears off the train tracks. We're trying to do these things. But now we've got coyotes and raccoons and in my case, white-tailed jackrabbits in the city. And how do we balance that? And so we enter into that system, and death has to be there. It has to operate. And the question is not that death operates, but how it operates. So I'm on the side of the animals for the ethical treatment, or the people for the ethical treatment of animals. I don't think it's a good idea to put cosmetic dyes in the eyes of rabbits, just so that we get the right kind of lip balm, right? Or some other shade. I think this is horrific. And I think we need to change on that kind of thing. But on the other hand, I'm not with that particular group when they say no death ever, stop everything. It just doesn't seem to me to make any sense about how the world actually works. So, is that?
John, thanks for your talk. I resonate with what you're saying, but I inevitably have conversations with fairly conservative Christians. And what tends to come up over and again is the question of the fall.
Right.
And I think, some of the statements in Scripture that death came as part of the fall.
Right.
I've always maintained that my biologist friends tell me that death is really part of the created order. I mean, God didn't recreate the lion's stomach after the fall. There seems to be no evidence. This is sort of now, and yet this is probably not a question for you, but maybe for the group, for some of the theologians in here. Help me perhaps understand how one can maintain somewhat a connection to what seems to be a very important story in the Scriptures. The story of the fall, it seems to be very important.
Right.
Yet, how can we put that together with death? How do we take some of those statements and are they strictly myth? That's maybe my question, but maybe I think there may be I'd love your answer, but others might want to join.
Yeah. Well, I've certainly worked with that one, Jack. That's a critical question. And in fact, the exercise I use, we have a class we call it the evil class, right? It's the theology of evil, theology 343, the theology of evil. So it's the evil class. And I go in and present this kind of material. But what I do is take 4 different theologians. I take the traditional view, and then 3 others from different theologians of their view and interpretation of Genesis 3. And it's quite remarkable what's happened over the last 40 years. And so N.T. Wright, if you know that name, is a theologian who is just very clear on this. Richard Middleton that I cited here, and there are many others. And they're looking back at this, and we have read into that text a particular understanding. And it's very much an Enlightenment understanding. Now you go to the historians, and you go to the medieval period, and it turns out they didn't see death the way we see death. It wasn't, the problems that are our problems are not theirs. If you go to the Old Testament, it turns out that the discussion about Adam ends in Genesis 3. It doesn't show up again. And he doesn't show up until, and Dennis, I got this from your talk, thank you very much, so I'm going to stop right there. You need to come tomorrow night and find out why. Okay? But I think theologians are doing a lot of serious work with this. Now, I will say this, though, I said this to the students earlier. Some of the wisest things I heard from a colleague in the American Scientific Affiliation, Walt Hearn, when I was starting graduate school, talking about evolution and questions, and he said to me, John, when you're talking with your students, give them time to go on the journey that you've gone on. I did not come to this place immediately. I spent a lot of time with a lot of careful men and women thinking carefully about this before. And I do think we need, in the church as a whole, to give one another some grace and some room. And especially today, we're in a highly polarized kind of my way or the highway is it seems to be the approach sometimes. And I think we just need to be a lot more careful about that. And so I have good friends who disagree and say, no, I don't see it that way at all. And we just disagree on this particular thing. But there are many other things we agree on. So, thanks, Jack.
So I think we should end there. So